Invade Earth. Are you insane? Galactic Council new meeting. The emergency light above the chamber door was already red when I arrived. I had not seen that light in 47 years of diplomatic service. The last time it burned red, a Krell warfleet had consumed 3 inhabited systems in 6 standard days, and the Galactic Council had barely managed to scramble a ceasefire before a 4th planet went dark. That crisis had taken 11 months to resolve, and left half the senior council permanently changed by what they witnessed. Some of them never came back to the chamber at all. But this light, burning red today, was not about the Krell. I am Vethkai, Senior Ambassador of the Zarelian Collective. I have served on the Galactic Council for longer than most junior delegates have been alive. I have sat through border disputes that lasted decades, trade wars that reduced entire economies to rubble, and one particularly ugly session involving the Drauvian ascendancy that I have been legally bound not to discuss for another 30 years. I thought I had seen everything this chamber could produce. I was wrong. The message that had summoned all of us back from our respective homeworlds and outposts and diplomatic retreats was short. It had come in on every open frequency simultaneously, which was itself unusual. Emergency summons typically went through coded diplomatic channels, routed through 3 layers of encryption, verified by retinal scan and biological signature. This one had simply appeared, unannounced, on every receiver in the known galaxy, in 43 languages, at exactly the same moment. 4 words. We have found Earth. That was all it said. No coordinates, no context, no explanation of what finding Earth meant, or what was going to happen next, or why the Council needed to convene immediately upon receiving the message. Just those 4 words, hanging in the communication channels like smoke after a fire. I had heard of Earth, of course. Every diplomat of my generation had. It was one of those topics that senior officials mentioned in hushed voices at the end of long evenings, after the formal dinners were finished and the junior staff had been sent away. It was the kind of subject that older ambassadors brought up carefully, watching the faces of whoever was listening, measuring how much the other person already knew, before deciding how much to add. I knew enough. I knew that Earth was the homeworld of the human species, located in a quiet corner of the Orion Arm, orbiting a medium-sized yellow star that most galactic charts marked with nothing more than a survey code and a warning notation. I knew that humans were a relatively young civilization, technologically primitive compared to most council members, and that they had not yet developed faster-than-light travel on their own. I knew that they were aware of the galaxy around them, because they had received several diplomatic contacts over the past few centuries, and that those contacts had produced mixed results, which was the polite way of saying that at least 2 of the civilizations involved no longer existed in any meaningful form. What I did not know, and what I suspected I was about to find out, was why those 4 words had been enough to turn the emergency light red and pull every senior diplomat away from whatever they were doing within a single standard day. The chamber was filling up fast. I took my usual seat near the back left section, the one that gave me a clear line of sight to the main podium and also to the secondary exits, which was a habit I had developed early in my career and never quite managed to let go of. Beside me, old Ambassador Pelrix of the Drauvian Ascendancy was already seated, which surprised me, because Pelrix's homeworld was farther from the council station than mine was. She must have left the moment the message came through. She was ancient. I mean that in the most literal sense. Pelrix had been serving on the Galactic Council since before humans had discovered metal. She had watched civilizations rise and collapse, and rise again, across timescales that made my own considerable lifespan feel brief. She had 4 eyes, 2 of which were always open regardless of her sleep cycle, and skin that had turned the color of deep ocean stone somewhere around her 400th year. She was, by any reasonable measure, the wisest person in the room. She was also, at this moment, very still. Not the stillness of calm. Pelrix was often still when she was calm. This was a different kind of stillness, the kind that came from someone who had already processed the implications of a situation and arrived at a conclusion they were not happy about. You left early, I said quietly, settling into my seat. I left immediately, she replied, without turning any of her eyes toward me. She was watching the chamber fill, cataloging faces the same way I always did. So did everyone else who was old enough to understand what the message meant. And what did it mean? She turned 2 of her eyes toward me then. Just 2. The other two kept watching the room. It meant, she said quietly, that someone found them before someone else could warn them not to. I did not get a chance to ask what she meant by that, because at that moment, the chamber doors opened at the far end, and Supreme Coordinator Mahaldris took the podium, and the noise in the room, which had been considerable, dropped immediately to silence. Mahaldris was a solvan, a species that communicated primarily through bioluminescent patterns on their upper membranes, with spoken language being a secondary system they had developed specifically for interspecies diplomacy. She was tall, silver blue, and moved with the kind of deliberate precision that came from a species that had been practicing diplomatic protocol for longer than most galactic civilizations had been spacefaring. She did not begin with pleasantries. "This council has received a formal motion," she said, her voice even and controlled, "from the Yenish Imperium, requesting authorization for coordinated military action against the planet designated Sol 3, also known, in the local language of its primary inhabitants, as Earth." The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then the chamber erupted. I had been in noisy council sessions before. I had been present during the Grothian border crisis, when 17 species were shouting over each other simultaneously. I had sat through the crystalline debates, where the sonic communication of the crystalline ones had physically shattered 3 recording devices before the acoustic dampeners were adjusted. I thought I knew what a loud council chamber sounded like. This was something else. The crystalline ones in the upper gallery rattled their entire exoskeletons, which was their species equivalent of standing up and screaming. The Grothian delegation, all 5 of them, had gone completely pale, which was remarkable, because Grothians were normally a deep amber color, and I had never seen one change shade under any circumstances. One of the Chennari elders near the front was gripping the edge of her console with both upper hands and 2 of her lower ones, which meant she was either very angry or very frightened, and from her posture, I was guessing the latter. And in the midst of all of it, standing at the podium with his crest fanned wide and his compound eyes bright, was Lord Admiral Skreeks of the Yenish Imperium, looking for all the galaxy like a being who had just proposed something very sensible and was puzzled by the reaction he was getting. I studied him for a long moment. The Yenish were a warrior culture, by their own description and by observable evidence. They had expanded across 6 systems in the past 2 centuries, through a combination of military force and strategic annexation that the Council had repeatedly condemned without managing to actually stop. They were disciplined, methodical, and genuinely skilled at the kind of warfare that most galactic civilizations practiced, which involved fleet engagements at range, orbital bombardment of strategic targets, and the projection of force through technological superiority. They were, in other words, very good at a very specific kind of conflict. And they had looked at Earth, run their numbers, reviewed their intelligence reports, and decided that this specific kind of conflict was exactly the kind that would work there. I watched Skreeks wait for the noise to die down, his posture comfortable, his crest still high. He had clearly prepared for resistance. He had clearly prepared arguments. He was ready to present his case with confidence. What he had not prepared for was what Pelrix did next. She did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She simply activated her personal speaker channel, which, in a chamber full of shouting delegates, cut through the noise the same way a single clear tone cuts through static. "Lord Admiral," she said. The room quieted. Not completely, not immediately, but enough. When Pelrix spoke in a council session, people listened. It was one of those unwritten rules that everyone understood without being told. Skreeks turned his compound eyes toward her. "Ambassador Pelrix, I welcome the opportunity to address your concerns." "I have not expressed a concern," she said. "I have a question." He inclined his head. "Of course. Have you read the Carenthis Accords?" A small pause. "I have reviewed the relevant sections pertaining to." "Have you read the Vulgrath footnotes?" Another pause, slightly longer. "The footnotes are supplementary documentation, and not strictly binding on." "Have you read," she continued, in exactly the same tone, as though he had not spoken at all, "the 17 warnings?" The document appended to the official galactic survey of Sol 3, written by the joint assessment team that visited the system 80 years ago, marked in 6 languages as required reading for any delegation considering interaction with the inhabitants of that planet. The chamber was very quiet now. Screeks's crest lowered slightly. Just slightly. My intelligence team has reviewed all relevant historical documentation concerning the humans and their capabilities. The assessment is clear. They are a pre-warp civilization, with no directed energy weapons, no shielding technology, no... Lord Admiral. Pelrix's voice did not change. It did not harden or rise or take on any particular edge. It simply stopped him. I am going to ask you one more question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer it. She turned two of her eyes directly toward him. Have you ever spoken to anyone from the Vreth Communion? Complete silence. Screeks opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The Vreth Communion is no longer a spacefaring civilization, he said finally. No, said Pelrix. They are not. She said nothing else. She did not need to. She turned her eyes back toward the front of the chamber and settled into her seat as though the matter was already decided. But it was not decided. Screeks was not finished. And I, watching the room, watching the junior delegates from younger civilizations who had no idea what the Vreth Communion was or why its current status was significant, understood that this session was going to be much longer and much harder than Pelrix's 2-second response had made it seem. Mahaldras called for order, and the chamber slowly, reluctantly settled. Screeks returned to his prepared remarks. I opened my personal log and began to write. Because someone needed to record this. Not for the official transcript, which would be sanitized and formatted and archived according to council protocol, but the real record. The one that included the sound of 37 species making noise simultaneously when a single motion was announced, and the particular quality of silence that followed Pelrix's question about a civilization that no longer traveled among the stars. Screeks began to speak, and I wrote, and outside the chamber windows, the stars held perfectly still, the way they always did, indifferent to whatever small dramas played out among the tiny beings who had learned to travel between them. I had a feeling, sitting there with my log open and Screeks's voice filling the room with confident, detailed, thoroughly researched arguments for doing something that every senior diplomat in the chamber knew was catastrophically wrong, that the stars were about to become a great deal more interesting. I was right. But not in any way that Screeks had planned. The motion had been formally submitted. The debate had officially begun. And somewhere out there, in a quiet corner of the Orion Arm, orbiting a medium-sized yellow star, 8 billion human beings were going about their day, with absolutely no idea that a council of 47 galactic civilizations had just started arguing about whether to send a fleet to their doorstep. I kept writing. The emergency light above the door stayed red, and Pelrix, beside me, sat perfectly still, watching everything, saying nothing more, with the patience of someone who had already seen how this kind of story ended. I would later learn that during this entire session, at the exact moment Screeks submitted his formal motion, a human monitoring station at the edge of their solar system had picked up our council's emergency broadcast frequency. The signal was faint. It was encoded. By all reasonable technical assessment, no pre-warp civilization should have been able to decode it. By all reasonable technical assessment. I wrote that down too, and underlined it, and next to it, I wrote a single note to myself that I would not fully understand for another 3 days. The note said, "They already know we are talking about them." At the time, I thought I was being poetic. I was not being poetic. The second session began 4 hours after the first one ended, and by then, the chamber had a completely different feeling. During the recess, information had moved. That was the thing about diplomatic communities. About any gathering of intelligent species with communication technology. Information moved between sessions, the way water moved through cracks in stone. Quietly, persistently, and in directions that no official agenda could control. The junior delegates from the younger civilizations, the ones who had looked confused during Pelrix's exchange with Screeks, had spent the recess talking to their senior colleagues. I had watched some of those conversations from the corridor outside the refreshment area, where I stood with a container of something warm that tasted approximately like the Zarelian tea I had grown up drinking, and I had seen the expressions on young faces change as the older diplomats explained things. It was not a gradual change. It was the sharp, sudden kind. The kind that happened when someone told you something that your mind needed a moment to actually absorb. I recognized it because I had worn that expression myself, 30 years ago, when my own senior mentor had sat me down after a council session and explained, in very careful and methodical detail, why the human survey notation existed and what it actually meant when translated out of the careful, measured language of official galactic documentation into plain and honest speech. Screeks was already at the podium when I returned to my seat. He had used the recess to prepare. His staff had assembled displays on the main screen behind him, charts and data readouts and tactical assessments. All of it organized with the kind of professional precision that the Yenish military was genuinely good at. Whatever else could be said about Screeks, and quite a lot could be said, he was thorough. He waited until the chamber had filled and Mahaldris had formally reopened the session, and then he began his presentation. The planet designated Sol 3, he said, pulling up the display, has a surface area of approximately 510 million square kilometers, of which roughly 30% is landmass. Its population, as of the most recent survey data, is approximately 8 billion individuals. The dominant species is bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, oxygen-breathing, with a lifespan averaging 7 to 9 decades depending on region and access to medical technology. The display shifted to show technical specifications. Their most advanced spacecraft are chemically propelled, limited to their own solar system, and incapable of faster-than-light travel. Their most powerful weapons, based on electromagnetic radiation detection, appear to be nuclear devices, which are significant at a planetary surface level, but pose no meaningful threat to a shielded fleet operating from orbital distance. Their defensive infrastructure consists of ground-based projectile and missile systems, atmospheric aircraft, and surface naval vessels. They have no orbital defense platforms, no energy shielding technology, and no directed energy weapons of any military classification. He paused and let the data sit there on the screen. By every objective military metric, he continued, Earth represents a low-risk, high-value strategic acquisition. The system contains 17 asteroids with concentrated rare mineral deposits that the Yenish Imperium has identified as critical for next-generation propulsion development. The planet itself has abundant biological resources and a temperate climate across significant portions of its surface. The indigenous population, while requiring some management, could potentially be integrated into a productive labor framework within 2 to 3 generations. I heard a sound from somewhere to my left, a quiet sound, barely audible. I glanced over and saw that old Sivith, the Chennari elder, had made it. Sivith was one of the oldest beings in the chamber, even older than Pelrix, and she had made a sound that I had never heard a Chennari make before. It took me a moment to identify it. It was the Chennari equivalent of a laugh, not a happy one. Screeks did not hear it, or if he did not understand its significance. He continued with his presentation. The proposed operation would involve a fleet of 340 warships, approaching from the outer system at reduced speed, to minimize detection time. Initial orbital bombardment of identified military installations would neutralize ground-based defensive capacity. Landing forces would then... Lord Admiral. It was not Pelrix this time. It was Ambassador Corvan of the Obelisk Remnant. I say remnant because what had once been the Obelisk civilization was not what it used to be. Screeks stopped. He turned toward Corvan's section of the chamber. Corvan was a tall being, thin in the particular way of the Obelisk, with 4 upper limbs and 2 lower ones, and eyes positioned for a wide field of vision. He was the senior Obelisk delegate, which meant he was one of the highest-ranking members of a species that had once been among the most formidable military powers in this region of the galaxy. Lord Admiral, Corvan said, and his voice was controlled, very controlled, in the way of someone who was working hard to keep it that way. You mentioned that human spacecraft are limited to their own solar system. That is correct. And that they have no orbital defense platforms. Correct. And that their most powerful weapons are nuclear devices, which pose no threat to a shielded fleet. Also correct. All of this is documented in... My civilization sent 400 warships to Earth, Corvan said. The chamber went very quiet. Screeks's crest did not move. He had clearly known about the Obelisk engagement. It had been in his research. He had an answer prepared. The Obelisk engagement occurred under significantly different tactical circumstances, and the Obelisk fleet at that time was operating under outdated engagement protocols that 400 warships, Corvin repeated, in the same controlled voice. We approached from the outer system. We broadcast surrender demands. We were confident. Our tactical assessment of their capabilities was, in all technical respects, identical to yours. He paused. I will not describe what happened next. The official record exists, and you may read it. What I will tell you is this. Of the 4 ships that returned, the crews were alive. They were uninjured. The humans had allowed them to leave. The word allowed sat in the chamber like something physical. They allowed them to leave, Corvin said again, as though making sure the word had been properly heard. Not because they could not pursue, not because they were exhausted or had depleted their resources. They allowed those 4 ships to leave because they chose to, because they decided that letting them go would send a clearer message than not letting them go. He sat down. Skreek stood at the podium with his display still active, all his charts and data and tactical assessments glowing behind him in the chamber light, and for the first time since I had arrived that morning, his crest was not perfectly upright. I wrote in my log, Skreeks is beginning to understand that there is a difference between what his intelligence reports contain and what actually happened. But he was not finished. That was the problem. He had come too far and committed too publicly to simply step back from the podium and withdraw the motion. He was a military commander. He had prepared for opposition. He had prepared for doubt. He had not prepared for the specific quality of warning that was filling this chamber from every direction, but he was trying to process it as something he could argue against. He took a breath and adjusted his approach. The Obelisk engagement was a tactical failure, he said carefully, due to specific decisions made by their command structure. We have analyzed those decisions in detail. We have developed an operational plan that avoids the errors that led to that outcome. I would ask the Council to consider the data on its merits rather than allowing historical emotional responses to... Emotional? Sivith spoke now. She did not raise her voice. She was a Chennari elder, and Chennari elders had been practicing the art of speaking quietly and being heard across long distances for so many generations that it was almost a biological trait at this point. I made first contact with the humans, Lord Admiral. Peaceful contact. On behalf of the Galactic Collective, 60 years ago, I stood across a table from a human diplomatic representative and offered membership in the earliest form of what became this council. Skreeks waited. They asked us very intelligent questions, Sivith said. Questions about governance structures and resource-sharing agreements, and the rights of minority civilizations within the collective framework. Questions that my own team had not fully anticipated, which required us to adjourn twice to consult with our legal scholars. They were, in every measurable sense, excellent diplomatic partners. She paused. At one point during the second day of talks, my senior colleague made an observation about the pace of human technological development. He was trying to be encouraging. He said something to the effect that humanity showed great promise and might, in time, develop toward a fuller participation in galactic society. Another pause. The human representative looked at my colleague and said, very quietly, that he should be careful about how he finished that thought. Skreeks opened his mouth. My colleague laughed, Sivith said, because he was nervous and did not know what else to do. The human did not laugh. The human waited, and then my colleague, to his credit, understood that he had said something offensive, and he apologized, and the human accepted the apology and moved on. She folded her upper hands together. After the session, we ran a biological scan on the human representative. Standard procedure. His cardiovascular response was elevated throughout the exchange. His stress chemistry was at levels that would have caused any of 3 other species in this chamber to enter an involuntary defensive response. His external temperature had risen by nearly half a degree. She looked at Skreeks directly. But his hands were steady. His voice was steady. He was not frightened. He was not angry. He was something else. We spent 3 weeks afterward trying to find a word for it in Chennari, and eventually we had to invent one, because we had never needed that word before. What word? Asked one of the younger delegates, unable to help themselves. Sivith glanced toward the voice. The closest translation in the Council's common language is something between ready and inevitable. She paused. It is the state of a being that has already decided what it will do if a situation develops in a certain direction. Not hoping it will not develop that way. Not afraid it might. Simply ready. Already decided. Waiting to see if the decision becomes necessary. She turned back toward Screeks. That was a diplomatic representative. Trained for calm. Trained for patience. Trained specifically to be the most reasonable version of their species available. She let that sit. Screeks said nothing. I have sometimes thought, Sivith continued, after a moment, about what a different kind of human might have looked like in that room. A different kind of human, responding to a different kind of approach. Not a diplomatic one. She stood, slowly, with the particular dignity of the very old. I recommend, Lord Admiral, that you do not pursue this line of thinking experimentally. She sat back down. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then Mahaldris called a second recess, and the noise came back all at once as delegates turned to their neighbors, and their communication devices, and each other. I looked at my log, and found that I had written 3 full pages without noticing. I looked at the main display, where Screeks's tactical charts were still glowing, patiently waiting for someone to continue the presentation. I looked at Screeks himself, standing at the podium, his crest now at exactly half-mast, looking at his data with the expression of someone who was starting to suspect that his data was missing something important. And then I looked at Pelrix, who had not moved, had not spoken, had simply sat beside me through all of it, and I asked her quietly, "How does this end?" She considered the question for a moment. "It ends," she said, "the same way it always ends when someone in this chamber suggests something that cannot be unsaid, with a great deal of noise, and then with silence, and then with the pretense that the motion was always going to be withdrawn, and everyone had known it from the beginning." She turned one eye toward me. "The difficult part is getting from here to there without anyone doing something that cannot be undone." I looked at Screeks again. "You think he might push through with it?" "No," she said. "Not after Corvin spoke. Not after Sivith." She paused. "But there are other members of the Yenish Imperium who are not in this chamber right now, and who have not heard what has been said here today, and who are still looking at the same intelligence reports that Screeks brought to that podium this morning." She turned back toward the front. "That is the thing about information, Vethkai. It does not travel evenly, and decisions made in the absence of the right information have a way of moving faster than the information that would stop them. I wrote that down too." The recess ended. The chamber refilled. Screeks returned to his podium, and somewhere, on a planet in the Orion Arm that none of us had ever visited, 8 billion people were still going about their day. The third session of the day began with a request that nobody in the chamber had expected. Ambassador Corvin, who had already spoken once and could have spent the rest of the session in silence, asked Mahaldris for permission to enter supplementary documentation into the official record. This was not unusual in itself. Supplementary documentation was entered into the record all the time, particularly during complex sessions involving historical precedent, but the way Corvin asked was different from the usual procedural request. He asked quietly, with a particular phrasing that in obelisk diplomatic language carried a specific weight. He was not simply adding documents. He was asking the council to sit with something. Mahaldris granted the request. What came up on the main display then was not a tactical chart or a survey report or any of the kinds of documents that Screeks had been presenting. It was a recording. The recording was old. The visual quality was degraded by both time and the damage that had been done to the recording system that captured it, and the audio carried the particular distortion of a transmission that had traveled a very long distance through interference. But it was clear enough to watch and clear enough to hear. It showed the interior of an obelisk command vessel. I had seen images of obelisk warships before, in historical files. They were impressive structures, functional and precise in the way of a military species that took its engineering seriously. This particular command center was the flagship of what the caption in the recording identified as the 3rd Obelisk Expeditionary Fleet, which I recognized as the force that had been sent to Earth. The recording began mid-conversation. A date stamp in the corner placed it at the 3rd day of what the obelisk designated the Sol engagement. An obelisk commander was standing at the center of the room, surrounded by tactical staff, looking at a display that showed the human planet from orbit. The display was covered in data readouts. The commander was speaking to a communications officer. The audio was partially reconstructed, but most of it came through. "Repeat the demand," the commander was saying. Third transmission, full power. If they have not responded by Commander, the communications officer's voice carried something in it. We have a response. Finally. The commander turned toward the communications station. Put it through. What came through was a human voice. The translation was running in real time, overlaid on the audio, slightly behind the original speech, so that both could be heard in sequence. The voice was calm. Not calm the way someone was calm when they were frightened and hiding it. Not the performed calm of a diplomat in a difficult meeting. Something else. The kind of calm that existed before a decision, not after one. The voice said, "This is Captain Alan Mercer of the U.S. Permanent Defense Station, transmitting on behalf of the Unified Planetary Defense Authority. We have received your demands. We are not going to comply with them." A pause. "We are going to ask you to leave." Another pause. "If you are not willing to leave voluntarily, we are going to ask you once more. If you are still not willing to leave after that, we will stop asking." The recording cut. The chamber was completely silent. Not the restless, suppressed kind of silence that came from a large group of beings trying not to talk all at once. The actual, complete, still kind of silence that happened when everyone in a room was processing something at the same time. Corvin let the silence last for a moment. Then he said, "That transmission was sent 11 minutes after our fleet arrived in Earth orbit. We had 387 warships at that point. By our analysis, the planet's population had been aware of our approach for approximately 6 hours before we entered the system." He waited. "What did they do during those 6 hours?" One of the younger delegates asked. I recognized her. Her name was Mira, representing a small but technically advanced civilization called the Sorvith, who had joined the Council about 20 years ago, and were still in the phase of learning how things worked. "We were able to reconstruct some of it afterward," Corvin said. "From the transmissions we intercepted. They did several things. They moved what they called non-combatant populations out of predicted target areas. They powered up their ground-based defensive systems. They coordinated between their various national governments, which at that time were still not fully unified, to establish a single command structure for the response." He paused. "But that is not the most interesting thing they did." He looked at the chamber. "The most interesting thing they did was send a message to a facility in one of their mountain ranges, deep underground, where we later learned they kept certain of their oldest and most dangerous long-range weapons in a state of maintained readiness. The message activated those systems." Another pause. "But it did not order them to fire. It put them in a state of readiness and told the crews to wait." He let that information move through the room. "They had weapons we did not know about," he said. "They had positioned them deep underground, shielded, not because they lacked the technology to build orbital platforms, but because they had calculated that underground positioning made them survivable through an initial orbital bombardment that might destroy surface installations. They had planned for the scenario. Not for us specifically, for the general category of a technologically superior force, arriving with hostile intent." He looked at Screeks. "They had been thinking about this for a very long time. They had built their defenses not to look impressive, but to function after an attack. They had assumed that any enemy would try to destroy the things that looked threatening first. So they hid the things that were actually threatening and left the things that looked threatening in plain sight." The chamber noise started to come back, low and murmuring. Mahaldris did not suppress it this time. "What happened to the fleet?" Mira asked. Corvan was quiet for a moment. "The fleet engaged planetary defenses on the 4th day," he said. "I am not going to describe the engagement in detail. The official record contains a full account for anyone who needs it. I will say that the outcome was not what our tactical projections had anticipated." He took a breath. "On the 11th day, I gave the order to withdraw." He said it simply, without excuse or apology. 4 ships returned. Their crews were alive and unharmed. As I told the chamber earlier, the humans let them go, but they did something else first. He looked around the room. They sent a message to the 4 retreating ships, not a threatening message, not a demand. A message that said, in our language, which they had apparently been studying since the first communication, that they understood our crews had been following orders, that they held no lasting grievance against the individuals aboard, and that we were free to go in peace. The murmuring in the chamber stopped. "It also said," Corvin continued, "that if we sent another fleet, the answer would be different. He sat down. I looked at my log and realized I had stopped writing and was simply staring at the main display where the recording had been playing. The screen was blank now. Just a flat gray field where the image had been. I made myself start writing again. I wrote, "The Obelisk fleet was one of the largest ever assembled in this region of the galaxy. The engagement lasted 11 days. 4 ships survived. The humans sent a polite message." I stared at those words. Then I added, "The polite message is somehow the most alarming part." Screeks was at his seat now, not the podium. He had stopped going back to the podium after each speaker. I watched him from across the chamber. He was reading something on his personal display. His crest had come all the way down, which in Yenish body language meant something close to deep thought or active recalculation. He was not the same being who had walked into this chamber this morning. That was progress. The question was whether it was enough. Mahaldris called the next speaker. It was an older delegate from the Sorvan Collective, a species I did not know well, whose civilization occupied a cluster of systems not far from human space. He had been waiting patiently to speak since the second session, sitting in his section with his large, flat hands folded on the console in front of him. He stood. He said his name was Davin, that he had served as his civilization's nearest neighbor observer to the Sol system for 30 years, and that he had something to add that was not in any official record, because it had never seemed significant enough to formally document until today. He said that for the past 15 years, human radio transmissions had been reaching his monitoring station at the edge of his civilization's space, not because they were aimed there, but because they traveled in all directions, and eventually some of them arrived. He had made a practice of listening to them, with the help of a translation program that his station staff had assembled over time. He said most of what he heard was ordinary: daily life, entertainment broadcasts, news, disagreements, music, all the things that any civilization produced and transmitted without any awareness that someone else might be listening. But occasionally, he said, in the middle of an ordinary broadcast, something else would come through. He described one such moment. A discussion program, human beings talking to each other about the state of their world. 2 voices. One of them asked, at some point in the conversation, what the other thought humanity would do if it ever encountered another spacefaring species. The second voice did not answer immediately. It paused. Then it said something that Davin had written down at the time, because it had struck him, and he had kept it in his personal notes for the past several years. He read it now from those notes. The voice had said, "I think we would try to be friendly first. I think we genuinely would. But if something tried to hurt us, or tried to take what we'd built, or tried to treat us like we didn't matter, I think whatever came here thinking it had an easy target would be in for the worst surprise it ever had. We've been fighting things for a long time. We've gotten very good at it. We had to." Davin set down his notes. "I have thought about that transmission often," he said, "particularly the last sentence. We had to. Not we chose to. Not we wanted to. They framed it as something that was required of them. By their circumstances. By their world. By their history." He looked around the chamber. "I did some research into their history afterward. I would recommend that Lord Admiral Screeks do the same, if he has not already. Not their technical history. Their social history. The record of how they treated each other, across the full span of their development as a species." He paused. "It is not a comfortable read, but it is an informative one, because everything they survived, everything they did to each other, they survived it. They kept going. They adapted. They changed. They developed something that in most species would eventually have ended them, and instead it seems to have made them harder." He sat down. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then Pelric spoke for the second time all day. "Mahaldris," she said, "I would like to formally request that the supplementary record entered today by Ambassador Corvin be classified and distributed to all council member delegations, along with Ambassador Davin's personal notes, the Obelisk engagement archives, the Chennari first contact records, and the full text of the 17 warnings, including the sections that were marked optional reading." A pause. "There should be no optional reading," she said. "Not on this subject." Mahaldris agreed. The documents were formally entered. The distribution was authorized. I looked at my log. I had written more today than in any single session I could remember. Across the chamber, Screeks was still reading his personal display. His crest was still down. His staff had gathered around him, and they were talking in the low, quick voices of people reassessing a situation. Outside the chamber windows, the stars were the same as they had always been. I thought about a human voice, recorded 15 years ago, captured by a monitoring station as it traveled outward through space, saying, "We've been fighting things for a long time. We've gotten very good at it. We had to." I thought about what it meant for a species to say, "We had to," about becoming very good at fighting things. Then I thought about Screeks's tactical charts, still somewhere on the main display system, waiting patiently in the queue. I closed my log. The session continued. The fourth session of the day started with something that none of the official proceedings had anticipated. A junior aide from the Sorvith delegation, a young woman named Kellen, who had been sitting quietly at the end of her section all morning, asked Mahaldris for permission to enter a personal observation into the record. Junior aides did not speak in council sessions. It was not a written rule. It was simply the way things worked. The hierarchy of the chamber was clear to anyone who had spent more than a few sessions within its walls. Junior staff attended, recorded, supported their senior delegates, and kept their observations to themselves until they were in a position to make them matter. Kellen either did not know this rule or had decided that today was an exception. Mahaldris, who I suspected was curious what a junior aide had to say about any of this, granted the request. Kellen stood. She was young enough that the chamber protocols were probably still feeling formal and intimidating to her, but she did not look intimidated. She looked like someone who had been sitting on something for several hours and had finally decided it needed to be said. "I have been listening to everything presented today," she said. Her voice was steadier than I expected. "The tactical assessments, the historical records, the testimony from Ambassadors Corvin and Sivith and Davin, and there is something I have not heard anyone say that I think needs to be said." She looked at Screeks. "The intelligence reports that the Yenish Imperium compiled about Earth are accurate. Everything Lord Admiral Screeks said about human technology is correct. They do not have directed energy weapons. They do not have shielding technology. Their fastest ships are limited to their own solar system. Their most powerful weapons, by galactic standards, are primitive." She paused. "But I grew up on a world that borders a deep ocean," she said. "And when I was young, my teachers taught us about something that the things in the deep ocean had in common. The most dangerous things in that ocean were not the biggest. They were not the ones with the most impressive natural weapons. They were the ones that had survived the longest, the ones that had been tested the most, the ones that had been in the ocean since before most other things in it existed, and had outlasted ice ages and warming cycles and mass extinction events and every other thing the world had thrown at them." She looked around the chamber. "They were dangerous not because of what they had, but because of what they were, because of what surviving that long required them to become." She sat down. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then noise came back, but different from before. Less argument, more the sound of people thinking together. I wrote in my log, "Even the junior staff understand it. The question is whether the one person who needs to understand it has gotten there yet." I looked at Screeks. His crest was still down. He was listening. He had been listening, I realized, since Corvin had sat down and stopped speaking. The presentation was over. Screeks was no longer defending a position. He was sitting in a room full of experienced diplomats who were, in their various ways, all trying to explain the same thing to him, and he was listening. That was something. Mahaldris called the next speaker, and what followed over the next 2 hours was less a formal debate and more something I had only seen a few times in my long career. A collective accounting, one after another. Senior delegates who had never previously spoken about their civilization's experiences, near or with the human world, stood and added their piece to the record. A Grothian economist described how her civilization's early warning monitoring of the Sol system, put in place decades ago purely as a precaution, had detected not one but 3 independent human research programs that appeared to be working on faster-than-light theoretical models. Not because the humans had been told such technology was possible, but because they had looked at physics and decided that space was a problem to be solved, rather than a boundary to be respected. A communications specialist from the Drauvian Ascendancy described what she called the linguistic peculiarity of human military naming conventions. She had compiled a list. She presented it now. Human warships were named, she explained, not after victories or honored individuals or the natural features of their homeworld, the way most civilizations named their vessels, but after concepts. She read some of the names from the list. Relentless, unyielding, final answer, no quarter. She paused on one. There was a vessel, she said carefully, that was listed in their historical registry as decommissioned 20 years ago. It was called Your Last Mistake. Somewhere in the chamber, several delegates made sounds that in their respective languages indicated something between discomfort and involuntary amusement. The Dravian communications specialist did not smile. Their current active fleet includes vessels named Unending, Patient, The Long Night, and Certain Consequence, she said. Their exploration and diplomatic vessels, by contrast, bear names like Horizon, First Light, Wanderer, New Morning, and a research ship called What Waits Beyond. She set down her list. I have spent considerable time analyzing what this naming pattern indicates about how they conceptualize the two categories of vessel. Their warships represent states of being. Their exploration ships represent questions. The warships exist. The exploration ships seek. She looked at the chamber. A species that names its weapons after inevitabilities, and its dreams after open questions, is a species with a very clear internal division between what it is and what it hopes to become. She paused. That division matters. It means they know the difference. They are not naive about what they are capable of. They have simply chosen, so far, to lead with the other part. She sat down. I was writing as fast as I could. My log was fuller than it had ever been in a single day of council proceedings. Screeks had not spoken in over an hour. One of his aides leaned over and said something to him. He shook his head slightly. His aide sat back. Mahaldras called another speaker. This one was different from the others. He was a human. Or rather, he was not a human, but he had spent 30 years studying them from a distance, and more relevantly, he had been the Council's official observer to the Sol system for most of that time, responsible for maintaining a non-contact monitoring brief that allowed the Council to track human development without initiating diplomatic interaction. His name was Oren, and he was one of the few beings in the chamber who had actually been to the Sol system, not to Earth itself, to the outer edge of the solar system, where the human monitoring stations were sparse enough that his observation vessel had been able to maintain its position without being detected. Or so he had believed at the time. Oren was a careful speaker. He laid out his experience methodically. He had been observing the system for 3 decades, he said, cataloging human development, compiling technical assessments, filing regular reports, all of which were in the Council's classified archive. Then he said something that made the entire chamber completely still. 14 years ago, he said, a human vessel approached my observation post. Silence. It was a small vessel, a research and survey type, by their classification. Single crew compartment, limited long-range capability, not designed for deep space. It should not have been able to reach my position, which was at the very outer edge of their system, well beyond their standard operating zones. He paused. The crew had apparently noticed my vessel on a long-range sensor sweep. Their sensors were not, according to our technical assessments, capable of detecting a vessel of my class at that range. We later concluded they had built a sensor array whose specifications they had not publicly disclosed in any intercepted communication. Another pause. The human crew did not attempt contact. They approached to within visual range, held position for approximately 2 hours, and then withdrew. He looked around the chamber. Before they withdrew, they did one thing. They activated a communications laser, a very narrow-band, high-precision directional signal, pointed directly at my observation post. Not a broad broadcast, a targeted message. He let that sit. The message was in the Council's common language, he said, which they should not have had access to, which was, at that time, not publicly transmitted on any human-accessible frequency. Translated, it said, "We know you are watching. We do not mind. Please say hello when you are ready. We will wait." The chamber was so quiet that I could hear the environmental systems running. They then returned to their regular patrol route, Oren said. And to my knowledge, they have never mentioned the incident in any public communication. They told no one. They simply left the message and went home. He sat down. I looked at what I had written in my log, and then looked at Screek's, and then looked back at my log. I wrote, "They knew the entire time, and they waited. Not because they were passive, not because they were unaware, because they were patient." Then I underlined the last word. Patience was a quality that most galactic civilizations associated with either great wisdom or great age. You became patient when you had lived long enough that urgency seemed less important, when you understood that most things resolved themselves eventually, given enough time. But human patience, if Oran's account was accurate, was not that kind of patience. It was not the patience of age. It was the patience of something that had decided to give you the chance to make the right choice on your own, while remaining completely prepared to respond if you made the wrong one. It was the patience of a being that was already ready, and was choosing to wait anyway. I looked at Screeks one more time. His crest was almost fully flat now. His eyes were forward, fixed on the main display, which was blank. He was not looking at tactical charts anymore. He was looking at nothing, which in Yenish body language typically meant deep and genuine reconsideration. Mhaldris called a brief recess. I stood and stretched and walked to the corridor, and Pelrix walked beside me, and we stood for a moment looking out at the stars through the observation window at the end of the hall. "He is going to withdraw it," I said. "Yes," she said. "How much damage has already been done?" She considered. "Not much. This session will be classified. The motion will be noted in the official summary, as withdrawn for procedural reasons. The Yenish Imperium will not be formally censured, because a formal censure creates a public record that might reach human monitoring networks. And if it did, then 8 billion people would know that someone had formally proposed invading their world and been stopped by a vote." She paused, "and they would file that information away. Humans have very good memories for perceived threats. It is one of their more inconvenient qualities." I looked out at the stars. "You have read the full archives," I said. "Everything about them?" "Yes. What is the thing that surprised you most?" She was quiet for a long time. "That they are kind," she said finally. "Genuinely and consistently kind, in a way that exists alongside everything else they are. Both things are real. They are capable of extraordinary destructive force, and they make art. They are strategically brilliant in ways that have ended civilizations, and they write poetry. They name their weapons after inevitabilities, and they name their children after hopes." She turned away from the window. "That is the thing that surprised me most. Not how dangerous they are, how much they want not to be." The recess ended. We went back inside. The fifth session of the day was not what anyone expected. It began normally enough. Mhaldris called the chamber to order. The Sorvith delegation entered a final technical document into the supplementary record. Screeks's aide stood briefly to note a procedural question about the motion's timeline. Everything was moving, in the way of these things, toward a conclusion. And then the emergency alert triggered. Not the standing red light above the chamber door, which had been on all day. A different alert. The kind that came from the station's external monitoring systems. The kind that meant something had happened in the space immediately around the station, not somewhere else in the galaxy. Every screen in the chamber lit simultaneously. For a moment, nobody spoke. Everyone was looking at the same thing. On the main display, at the edge of the visual range of the station's external sensors, a ship had appeared. Not in the way ships normally appeared, through the registered arrival lanes, with transponder signals and approach clearances, and the various electronic identifications that made an incoming vessel legible to station systems. It had simply appeared, present, where it had not been a moment before. The station's automated systems were running their identification scan. The results came up within seconds. Single vessel, approximately 800 meters in length. Hull configuration not matching any council member registration database. Power readings consistent with an advanced fusion-type propulsion system. Weapons systems not actively engaged. Targeting arrays offline. All standard approach courtesy lights active. And a communications signal, broadcasting simultaneously on every standard diplomatic frequency, in 43 languages. I could read the common language version from my seat. "This is the U.S. inexorable. We are here as observers. We mean no harm. Please continue your meeting." The chamber erupted. Not with argument this time, with something more complicated. fear and shock and confusion and, in the case of several older delegates who had immediately understood what they were looking at, a particular kind of stunned recognition. Mahaldris activated the emergency dampeners, which brought the noise down to a level where she could be heard. "Everyone please remain seated," she said, which was already becoming unnecessary because most people were already back in their seats, staring at the main display. The inexorable had not moved. It was holding position at the edge of sensor range, lights on, signal broadcasting, exactly as its message described. Observing, not approaching, not powering weapons, not doing anything that could be read as aggressive. Simply being there. Screeks was on his feet. His crest was fully flat now, and his coloring had shifted by 2 or 3 shades toward the pale end of the yellowish spectrum, which was not a good sign. He was looking at his personal display, and then at the main screen, and then back at his personal display. "How," he said, to his aide, not bothering to keep his voice to a diplomatic level, "did they know this meeting was happening?" His aide said something I could not hear. Screeks made a sound that I can only describe as the yenish equivalent of a person sitting very heavily into a chair while already standing. Mira, the young Sorvith delegate, raised her hand toward Mahaldris. Permission to speak was granted. "Is that a warship?" she asked. The question was directed at Oren, the long-term observer, who was still in his seat, and who, I noticed, was the only person in the chamber who did not look surprised. "By human classification," Oren said carefully, "the Inexorable is designated as a heavy strategic deterrent vessel. It is, by their taxonomy, one of 5 vessels in that category currently in active service." "What does strategic deterrent mean?" Mira asked. "It means," Oren said, "that the vessel's primary function is not to fight. Its primary function is to be present, to make its presence known, to communicate, by its mere existence in a given location, that a response is available, and that the responding party is aware of the situation." Mira looked at the main display. "So it came here to let us know they know." "Yes," Oran said, "that is my reading. And it is just going to sit there? Until our meeting concludes, I would expect." "Yes." Mira was quiet for a moment. Then she asked a third question, the one that was on everyone's mind but that most of the senior diplomats were too experienced to ask directly. "How did they know where we were meeting? We are a council station. We do not broadcast our location on any public frequency." Oren looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the main display. "I believe," he said, "that is intended to be part of the message." The chamber was very quiet. I looked at the name on the display, the U.S. Inexorable. I had been thinking about naming conventions since the Dravian communications specialist had presented her list, and the word inexorable had been sitting in the back of my mind since I first read the identification data. I spoke 17 languages with professional fluency, and had functional literacy in another 12. Inexorable was from the human language called Latin, which was an ancient ceremonial language they still used in certain formal contexts, primarily in law and medicine, and the names of things that needed to sound permanent. Inexorable meant incapable of being stopped or persuaded, relentless in a way that contained no emotion, no anger, no desire, simply the forward motion of something that had decided to move, and would continue to do so. They had named their deterrent vessel Inexorable. I thought about the other names on the list. Certain Consequence, The Long Night, Patient. I thought about the exploration ships with their names like Questions, What Waits Beyond, and I thought about the message broadcasting on every channel. "We are here as observers. We mean no harm. Please continue your meeting." Please, that word. A small, courteous word. A word that belonged to the vocabulary of beings who were trying to be considerate of others, who understood that their presence might be startling, and were attempting to soften the impact of it. They had sent a heavy strategic deterrent vessel to observe a secret diplomatic meeting about whether to invade their world, and they had accompanied its arrival with the word, "Please." I wrote in my log, "They are not performing restraint. They are practicing it, and they are doing it from a position of complete situational awareness. They know we are here. They know what we are discussing. They came anyway, and they came politely." I underlined politely. Then I added, "This is a warning. It is also an act of generosity. They are giving us the chance to make the right decision without forcing us to make it." Skreek sat back down. He looked at the main display for a long time. He looked at his tactical charts, which were still queued in the display system's secondary presentation file. All those numbers and projections and capability assessments that had seemed so comprehensive this morning. He looked at the inexorable, sitting quietly at the edge of sensor range. He closed the tactical charts. His aide looked at him. He shook his head once. The aide began composing something on her personal device. I guessed she was drafting a communication back to the Yenish Imperium's command council. I guessed that communication was going to contain some significant revisions to the operational plan that had been under development before this session began. Mahaldris had the chamber's attention again. She looked around the room, taking in the faces, reading what she could read. "The council will take note," she said, "that an unregistered vessel identifying itself as the U.S. Inexorable has positioned itself at the edge of station sensor range and is transmitting peacefully on all standard frequencies. No action is required at this time." A pause. "The vessel's presence will be acknowledged via standard interspecies courtesy protocol, which this station will transmit within the next standard hour. Beyond that, we will proceed as scheduled." She looked around once more. "We were in the middle of a session. We will continue." And they did. But the character of the session had changed. The debate about capabilities and history and precedent, which had been going on all day, was still the formal content of the chamber proceedings. But everyone in the room, including Skreeks and his staff, was aware of the secondary conversation that was happening. The Inexorable was not in this room, but it was in the room. It sat there, patient, as the speakers took their turns and the supplementary documents accumulated in the official record, and the day moved toward its conclusion. It did not power any systems. It did not advance. It did not issue any further communications after that initial message. It waited. The way of being waited when they had already decided what they would do if a situation developed in a certain direction, not hoping it would not develop that way, not afraid it might. Already decided. Ready. Just waiting to see if the decision became necessary. I thought about that Chennari word that Sivith had described, the one they had invented after the first contact meeting, the one that meant something between ready and inevitable. Looking at the Inexorable on the main display, sitting still and polite at the edge of sensor range with its name glowing in the identification readout, I thought that word had found its perfect subject. Kellen, the junior aide who had spoken earlier, was looking at the main display from her seat at the end of the Sorvith delegations section. She had her personal log open, and she was writing something. I watched her for a moment. She caught me looking and gave a small nod, the kind of nod that passed between beings who were both witnessing something they expected to still be thinking about for a very long time. I nodded back. Outside the chamber windows, the Inexorable held its position among the stars. It was, objectively speaking, a small ship by galactic standards. A single vessel, 800 meters, no weapons powered. Against the scale of the galaxy, it was almost nothing. Almost. The formal conclusion of the chamber session happened quietly, the way the most significant things often did. Mahaldris had been managing the proceedings all day with the particular skill of a coordinator who understood that sometimes the most important part of her job was knowing when not to intervene and when to step in before something irreversible happened. She had been reading the room for hours, tracking the shift in the chamber's collective mood with the precision of someone who had been doing exactly this for a very long time. She knew, I was certain, what was going to happen before it happened. She called for a brief procedural recess, approximately 40 minutes before the standard end of session. During that recess, I watched Skreeks leave his seat and walk to a small consultation alcove at the side of the chamber, the one set aside for delegation internal discussions. His 4 senior aides went with him. They were in there for 11 minutes. When they came out, Skreeks walked directly to Mahaldris's coordinator position, spoke to her briefly and quietly, and then returned to his seat. When the session reconvened, Mahaldris stood at the podium and made an announcement. The Galactic Council has been informed by the Yenish Imperium delegation that the motion entered this morning, proposing coordinated military action against Sol 3, is formally withdrawn. The motion will be noted in the official proceedings as withdrawn at the request of the submitting delegation. No vote will be recorded. She paused. The session's supplementary documentation, testimony, and observational records will be classified at the highest council security level and distributed to all member delegation archives. No public summary of this session's specific content will be issued. Another pause. The council thanks all delegations for their participation in what has been a lengthy and thorough exchange. This session is adjourned. And that was it. No vote, no formal censure, no dramatic conclusion. The thing that had brought 47 civilizations representatives racing back to the council station within a single day, the thing that had triggered the red emergency light and filled the chamber with argument and testimony and historical record, simply ended with a procedural announcement and an empty podium. The chamber began to empty slowly. Delegates gathered their personal devices and spoke in low voices to their staff and neighbors, the way people always did at the end of a long day. The noise was quieter now than it had been at any point during the sessions. Not stunned exactly, more the exhausted, thoughtful quiet of a room full of beings who had spent many hours processing things they would be thinking about for a long time. I stayed in my seat until most of the others had gone. Pelric stayed beside me, as she had all day. We sat there while the chamber emptied and watched the main display, which had returned to the standard external view. The inexorable was still there. "It will leave when we leave," Pelric said. "That is my expectation." "Is it gone after that?" I asked. "Or does it stay in this region?" "I expect it returns to wherever they keep their strategic deterrent vessels," she said, "which we do not know, which is, I am certain, intentional." I thought about that. An 800-meter warship, capable of appearing without warning at a location that should have been undetectable, named Inexorable. And its crew had said, "Please." "What do we do now?" I asked. "Not about the session, about the larger question." Pelrix was quiet for a moment. "We do what we have always done," she said. "We continue. We manage the relationships between civilizations as carefully as we can. We try to prevent the kinds of mistakes that cannot be unmade." "And the humans?" "The humans," she said, "will continue to do what they have always done. They will look outward. They will build. They will send their ships with names like open questions into the dark between stars, looking for whatever waits beyond, and they will wait for someone to say hello." She stood, slowly. "And eventually someone will. And on that day, I think, the galaxy will be surprised again, not by how difficult they are to deal with, but by how much they were looking forward to the meeting." She gathered her things and walked toward the exit. I sat for a moment longer. The chamber was almost empty now. The environmental systems hummed quietly. The main display showed the stars and, at the edge of its range, the steady light signature of a single vessel holding position. I opened my log. I had written more today than in any previous session I could remember. Pages and pages of testimony, observation, context, the things people said and the things they did not say, and the expressions on faces when they heard something that changed the shape of what they understood. I looked at all of it for a moment. Then I wrote one final entry for the day. It said, "The motion was withdrawn. The record was made. The session is closed. But the inexorable is still out there, holding position, politely waiting for us to finish so it can go home." I paused. I have been in this work for a long time. I have watched civilizations come to the edge of decisions that could not be undone, and step back from them, and I have watched some of them not step back. Today, in this room, the right thing happened. Not because it was easy, not because anyone was forced, because enough voices spoke clearly enough for long enough that the weight of what was being considered became impossible to ignore. Another pause. I do not know if the humans are aware of how close this came. I suspect they know more than we think they know. They seem to, consistently, but I do not know if they know that today, in this chamber, a collection of beings from 47 civilizations sat together and argued them into safety. I stopped. "Actually," I added, "I think they might. I think they sent the inexorable because they already knew, and they wanted us to know they knew, and they wanted to make it easier for us to make the right choice by making it clear that making the wrong choice was not going to go the way anyone hoped." I closed the log. I stood. The chamber was empty now. The main display still showed the stars. The inexorable was still there, a quiet point of light among many quiet points of light. I walked to the exit. Behind me, the environmental systems kept running. The display kept showing the stars. The red emergency light above the chamber door, which had been on since I arrived, went out as I crossed the threshold into the corridor. The station's automated systems had registered the session as concluded. The emergency was officially over. I walked down the corridor toward the communication center, thinking about the message I was going to send to the Zarelian Collective's High Senate, thinking about what I was going to tell them, and how I was going to tell it, and what I was going to recommend. The corridor was quiet. Most of the other delegates had already gone to their quarters or their ships. Through the long observation window that ran the length of the corridor, I could see the stars, and among them, at the very edge of visual range, the lights of the inexorable. Still there, still patient, still waiting. I sat in the communications center for almost an hour before I started writing the report. That was unusual for me. I was a systematic correspondent. I had learned early in my career that the most effective reports were the ones written while the day was still clear in mind, before the specific details softened into general impressions. I always wrote immediately after sessions. It was one of those habits that my first mentor had drilled into me so thoroughly that it had become automatic. But tonight, I sat with my hands resting on the console and the empty transmission form in front of me, and I thought about everything that had been said in the chamber. I thought about Corvin's recording and Siveth's description of the human diplomatic representative with his elevated stress chemistry and his steady hands. I thought about Davin and the radio transmission he had kept in his personal notes for years, the human voice saying, "We had to." I thought about Oren and the message on the communications laser, the one that said, "We know you are watching. Please say hello when you are ready." I thought about the inexorable, my senator, whose name was Varys, and who had served in the High Senate for 30 years, and was one of the shrewdest political minds in the Zarelian Collective, had sent me a brief message during the third session recess. It was typical of her. 3 sentences. She had seen the emergency broadcast frequency and understood there was a significant session underway. She wanted a preliminary assessment of the situation's severity. She ended with a question that I had known she would ask eventually, and that I had not yet figured out how to answer. She wrote, "What are they like? The humans? Really?" That question had been sitting with me all evening. It was the right question. It was the question underneath all the tactical assessments and historical records and testimony. All of that information was important. All of it was true. But none of it quite answered what Varys was actually asking, which was not, what are their capabilities, or what is their history, but the deeper thing. The thing that actually mattered for the Zarelian Collective's long-term strategic positioning in a galaxy that now unambiguously contained human awareness and human attention. What were they like, really? I thought about the names of their ships again. I had been thinking about those names all day, the warships named after certainties, the exploration ships named after questions, the gap between those two categories, and what it said about a species that maintained both simultaneously. I thought about the word please in the inexorable's transmission. I thought about a civilization that had been in conflict for most of its history, that had spent hundreds of thousands of years in conditions of competition and scarcity and threat, that had by its own accounting become very good at surviving terrible things, and that had come out of all of it still writing poetry, still making music, still sending ships with hopeful names outward into the dark, and waiting, patiently, curiously, for someone to respond. I thought about Kellen, the junior aide, describing the creatures in the deep ocean of her homeworld, the ones that were dangerous not because of what they had, but because of what surviving had made them, the ones that had outlasted everything the world had thrown at them. And I thought about what Pelrix had said, in the corridor, when I asked her what surprised her most about them. That they are kind, she had said. Genuinely and consistently kind, in a way that exists alongside everything else they are. I started writing. The report took a long time. Varys had asked for the full account, and the full account was complicated. It required context. It required the historical records that had been entered today, and the testimony, and the procedural outcome, and the strategic implications, and the recommendation. But at the end of all of it, after the formal assessment was complete, and the recommendations were clearly stated, I wrote the section that answered Varys's question. I wrote, "You asked me what they are like. Really, I will try to tell you." They are the most individually variable species I have ever encountered in documentation. Their civilizations produce beings of extraordinary intelligence and beings of ordinary mediocrity in approximately the same distribution as every other species, but the range on both ends is wider. Their best minds are remarkable. Their worst impulses have, historically, caused them tremendous suffering. They are not naive. Do not make the mistake of reading their curiosity as innocence. They have been paying attention to the galaxy around them for longer than most of us realized, and what they have gathered from that attention is complex. They know they are not the most technologically advanced. They know they are not the largest. They know, from their own history, exactly what a more powerful civilization can do to a less powerful one, because they have done it to each other. They are not unaware of the risks of contact. And yet they sent a ship called New Morning. They have a research vessel called What Waits Beyond. They built a monitoring station at the edge of their solar system that spent years collecting our transmissions, and then, when they detected an observation vessel that should have been undetectable, sent a narrow-band message in our common language that said, "Please say hello when you are ready." That word, please, I cannot stop thinking about it. What they are, Senator Varys, is this. They are a species that survived everything their world produced and came out the other side with two things intact that should not, by any reasonable expectation, have survived together. First, a capacity for force that is, as the records I am transmitting alongside this report will demonstrate, genuinely without comfortable upper limit. Second, a genuine and persistent preference not to use it. Both things are real. I want to be absolutely clear about that. The capacity is not performance. The preference is not weakness. The preference exists because they have a word that appears in more than 40 of their currently spoken languages, in forms that predate cross-cultural contact, meaning something close to the value we place on preventing unnecessary harm. They call it different things. But they all have it. A civilization that produces that word independently, across isolated cultures, across thousands of years, has something in its nature that cannot be explained purely by strategic calculation. They want to meet us. They have wanted to meet us for a very long time. They have been watching and waiting and preparing, and occasionally sending small messages into the dark, in the hope that someone was listening, and the messages have always been, at their core, some version of the same thing. We are here. We see you. We are ready. Please say hello. I stopped writing. I looked at what I had written. It was longer than my reports usually were. Varys would not complain. She had asked a real question, and I had given her a real answer. I added one final paragraph. My recommendation for the Zarelian Collective is this. We should not fear the humans. We should not court them recklessly. We should extend diplomatic contact through the appropriate channels, carefully, respectfully, and with the full intention of building a genuine relationship, not because they are powerful, though they are, not because they are watching, though they are, but because a species that named its warships after inevitabilities and its exploration ships after open questions, and that sends messages saying please into an empty dark, is a species that has decided what it wants to be. And what it wants to be is our neighbor. I recommend we introduce ourselves. I signed the report, attached the session records and transmitted it. Then I stood, stretched, walked to the observation window at the end of the communication corridor, and looked out at the stars. The inexorable was gone. Sometime during the hour I had spent writing the report, it had simply left. No announcement, no departure signal, no courtesy broadcast on the standard frequencies. It had simply turned and gone, back toward wherever it was going, as quietly and precisely as it had arrived. I stood at the window for a while, looking at the space where it had been. I was not a being given to sentiment. 47 years of diplomatic service had not entirely removed the capacity for it, but they had taught me to be selective about when I let it matter. But standing there in the quiet corridor, with the session behind me, and the transmission sent, and the stars unchanged in front of me, I felt something. Not fear. That was important to name. The day had contained things that could have produced fear, and had produced something much more complicated in its place. Not relief, exactly. Relief implied that the danger was past, and I did not think the danger was past. I thought the danger was what it had always been, which was the possibility of a decision made from ignorance, and that possibility would exist as long as there were civilizations young enough not to know what they were considering. What I felt, standing at that window, was something closer to hope. The specific kind of hope that came from watching a room full of beings who should have known better, almost do something they couldn't take back, and then not do it. From watching history, carefully preserved and honestly presented, do the work it existed to do. And from watching a ship called Inexorable sit patiently at the edge of sensor range and wait, without threatening, without advancing, simply present and patient, and communicating through its presence alone, that some decisions had consequences that no amount of tactical preparation could change. I thought about 8 billion people on a planet I had never visited, going about their ordinary days, working and eating, and talking to each other, and looking up at their sky, which was beautiful by any standard, a blue that showed up in survey images, as unusual even among habitable worlds. Looking up at their blue sky and thinking about what was out there, waiting. In the corridor behind me, I heard the quiet footsteps of someone else who could not sleep. I turned and saw Oran, the long-term observer, walking toward the observation window with a container of something warm in his hand. He saw me and stopped. "Still here," he said. "Still here," I agreed. He came to stand beside me at the window and looked out at the same stars I had been looking at. "The Inexorable left about 40 minutes ago," he said. I noticed. "I watched it go," he said. "It was very precise, powered up its drives, oriented, accelerated smoothly, no wasted motion, very clean departure. Like everything else they do," I said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I have been watching them for 30 years. Everything they do has that quality. Even the things that look casual, even the things that look accidental." He paused. "Nothing is accidental." I thought about the message on the communications laser. "We know you are watching. Please say hello when you are ready." "Oran," I said, "in 30 years, did you ever send them a response?" He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said. "My brief was observation only, no contact." A pause. I thought about it. "More than once." "Why didn't you?" He turned to look at me. "Because it wasn't my place. Because the council hadn't authorized it. Because there were protocols, and I understood why the protocols existed." He looked back at the stars. "And also because I was not entirely certain what would happen once the conversation started. And I didn't want to be the one who started it without the council being ready." I nodded. "Are they ready now?" He was quiet for a very long time. "I think today was the beginning of ready," he said finally. "I think today was the day enough people in that room understood clearly enough what they were dealing with, that the conversation can start to happen properly. Not rushed, not from fear, not because someone forced it, but because enough people chose it." He looked at his container of warm liquid and took a slow drink. "They will wait," he said. "They have been patient this long. They will wait until we are actually ready. That is the thing about them, Vethkai. They give you time. They give you more time than you sometimes think you deserve." I looked at the stars. I thought about a word. Inexorable. And another word. Please. "Then we should not waste it," I said. Oren nodded. We stood at the window for a while longer, neither of us speaking, looking out at the stars and the quiet space where a single ship had been and was no longer. And I thought about the message I had sent, and the work that was ahead, and the long, careful, necessary process of becoming ready for a conversation that 8 billion people were already, patiently, waiting to have. The emergency light above the chamber door was dark. The stars were unchanged. Somewhere in the direction of a medium-sized yellow star in a quiet corner of the Orion Arm, a ship called Inexorable was making its way home. And in the communications center, transmitting now toward the Zorellian home system, was my report and my recommendation, and the last words I had written, which were also the truest ones. "They want to be our neighbor. I recommend we introduce ourselves." The corridor was quiet. The stars were steady, and the galaxy, enormous and old and full of things still to be discovered, went on turning, as it always had, as it always would, indifferent to the small but not insignificant fact that somewhere within it, something new was beginning. Something careful and considered and chosen. Something that had almost not happened, and had. Something that, if handled with the patience and honesty it required, might turn out to be the best thing any of us had ever been part of. I walked back to my quarters. In the morning, I would begin the work of what came next. Tonight, I slept better than I had in years.
By Steve Nash.